psychologist Daryl Wing Sue defined microaggressions as brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to certain individuals because of their group membership. I have honestly witnessed these over the years and tried to point them out to people. And, we get oh, that's just kids being kids. And that's just, how it is. And it's like, no, there's something deeper going on. So I'm excited for this and to listen to you, Cornelius, give us the education on microaggressions.
Well, I'm excited to be here and really appreciate Defeat the Label for the invitation. And Kevin, you're stepping all over my presentation. You're already quoting Dr. Daryl Wing Sue.
Well, it was in the stuff they gave me. Don't blame me.
Of course.
Don't be aggressive. No,
and thank you so much for sticking your feet in and doing some learning, because you're absolutely right. There's a world of scholarship that has been established about microaggressions, but because it intersects so much with personal identities and our intentions and the way we see ourselves, it can be difficult to grapple with the idea that I may be, people I care about may be, saying and doing things that invalidate the experiences of others. So with that said, thank you so much for the space and the time. I'm going to begin sharing my screen.
And you are up, sir.
All right, very good. Again, really appreciate being able to connect with you all today and talk about this very important issue that does impact so many of our students and adults as well. Again, my name is Cornelius Godfrey, and I serve as the Diversity and Equity Consultant for Oakland Schools, and really happy to be able to support the learning of educators who then impact the everyday experiences of students and families in our communities. So again, really appreciate this opportunity. So I want to give you a brief overview of what we'll discuss today. We'll begin with a conversation about some general definitions and talk about some misconceptions that may be associated with the idea or term microaggressions. Then we'll talk about impact and intentions and see why that matters. We'll talk about 4 ways to respond to microaggressions, and we'll even take some time to practice, because practice does make permanent. We'll talk about the idea of calling out versus calling in, and make some distinctions between those 2 behaviors and decide which one, if necessary, might be appropriate. And then hopefully we'll have a chance to address some questions and then close and give some space for some further connection. All right, so we'll begin with Dr. Daryl Wing Sue. This definition comes to us from the professor of psychology at Teachers College. He says, a brief commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults, and potentially harmful or unpleasant psychological impact on the target person or group. So there are a lot of really important terms that we'll kind of investigate as we move forward. But I also want to give you an opportunity to hear it from Dr. Daryl Wing Sue himself. So let's take a listen to this conversation.
So tell me just what exactly is microaggression?
Well, microaggressions are varying from being conscious, deliberate on the continuum to being outside one's level of awareness and unintentional. Microaggressions really are reflections of worldviews of inclusion, exclusion, superiority, inferiority, and they come out in ways that are outside the level of conscious awareness of an individual. When I'm asked, where were you born? And I say, I was born in Portland, Oregon. And they persist by saying, no, where were you really born? And I'll say, Portland, Oregon? And they'll say, no, what country were you born in? And I'll say the United States. They get very embarrassed. Now, this is an example that they are intending to make a personal connection, but the hidden communication, the true worldview, is that I am a perpetual alien or foreigner in my country. I am not a true American, because true Americans only look the following way. And that's what generates these behaviors that are microaggressions.
But you describe it as unintentional, and yet we've seen at the University of Missouri very blatant examples of racism.
You're right about that. Microaggressions vary from being conscious, deliberate, intentional, from old-fashioned racism and bias statements to the unintended consequences. And our studies do indicate that it's the hidden, unintentional forms of bias that are most damaging to people of color. And that, like at the University of Missouri, where you have people being called racial epithets or behaviors that are going on, it actually is only the tip of the iceberg. The reason why I believe students of color, faculty of color are reacting in such a major way is that they are experiencing a climate that is hostile, that is full of microaggressions. These hate incidents on campus are triggering off this discontent, pain, and feeling of being silenced.
But there are critics of your studies and the notion even of microaggression, which they say have morphed from 1970 when it was unintentional to now everything that happens, and that people are just being overly sensitive. They say if you coddle these students on campus, how does that prepare them to live in the real world?
The problem is that people believe microaggressions are very similar to the everyday incivility and rudeness that individuals, white Americans, experience in their day-to-day lives. They are quite different. Microaggressions for people of color are constant, continual, and cumulative. They occur to people of color from the moment of birth to when they die. And as a result, any one microaggression in isolation may represent the feather that breaks the camel's back. And people who don't see the lived experience of people of color and the daily onslaught that they experience tend not to believe that it's a major event.
There's another criticism because this has been called, some of the things that people are called, now they say the N-word and other things like that, is hate speech, and that it's protected by the First Amendment. So isn't that okay, given that kind of reasoning?
I think that people who say that we are preventing individuals from free speech don't realize, ironically, that it is people of color that historically have not been able to express themselves openly or freely without punitive actions being directed at them. And so there has to be this balance, but at the same time an understanding that there are limits to free speech when it harms and hurts people.
Why do you think that students commit microaggressions, or adults for that matter?
That's a good question. And I think it goes to the heart of the matter, that none of us are immune from inheriting the racial biases of our forebears. We have attitudes and biases that are delivered through microaggressions.
But when some of these microaggressions come out in the form of real hatred, is that solvable?
We can deal with that deliberately, but the subtle forms of microaggressions are hard to prove, hard to quantify in some way, and very difficult for us to take actions against, because people oftentimes don't perceive it as harmful and significant. People oftentimes tell me that white Americans are the enemy. I say, no, white Americans aren't the enemy. White supremacy is. It's the social conditioning of the superiority of one group over another. And many white Americans are equally victimized because they have been socialized into a society that tends to imbue them with these images that they believe in, but is no fault of their own. If you really reach white Americans, they can become valuable allies. One of the reasons why our research concentrates on the unintentional forms of microaggressions is very much what Maya Angelou said. It's the unintentional bias that does the greatest harm to people of color. And I oftentimes use the example that, when you look at the disparities and inequities we have in education, employment, and healthcare, it is not due to the overt racists or the white supremacists. It is due to the well-intentioned teachers who educate our children, employers who decide who to hire, who to retain, and who to promote. And it is those individuals who are unaware of their hidden biases that are having the major impact on our standard of living.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wing-Soo. Really appreciate him giving some context for us. And I really also appreciate the emphasis on the idea of the well-intentioned. And I really am happy to be able to have this conversation with folks who I believe have really good intentions. And now we can translate those good intentions with information to some positive outcomes for the students and families that we support. But first I wanted to address a misconception, and that's that this term micro equates to insignificance. I was actually with a group of educators just last evening, and I had someone raise the question, and I really appreciated to have the dialogue that talked about, well, doesn't micro mean that it's small or that it doesn't really matter much? But that's actually not the case. Micro just talks about the level of cover that these statements and behaviors take in our everyday conversations and lives, so that they are so unnoticeable to those who are not directly impacted by them. So again, moving into some conversation that Dr. Wing-Soo helped us to think about is this idea of intentions and impact. Intentions and impact. So if a microaggression is committed by someone who has positive intentions, surely those intentions must mean that there is less harm and therefore some credit given to the person who may have unintentionally said something that caused a negative impact for someone else. I'd like for us to consider, when we center the intentions of the person who delivered harm, what might we be doing? When we center those positive intentions, what we're really doing is making the center of that conversation the person's emotions, the person who inflicted the harm's emotions, feelings, and their perceptions about the world. And that's fine as long as that's something we're willing to reconcile. But I'd pose a different thought. What if we centered the harm or the person that was impacted? Because I believe when we place the recipients of the harm at the center of our conversation, that creates a pathway for repair and healing. And as educators, as family members, as community members, I think what we ought to focus on is how do we create some healing and restoration in relationships that have been harmed by these negative impacts of microaggressions. And speaking of impact, what are the impacts of microaggressions? Well, I'm glad you asked. This is a not exhaustive, but pretty long list of how microaggressions impact particularly our students. So we think about the fact that they have a negative impact on the classroom culture and climate. They interfere with learning because they jeopardize that feeling of safety, well-being, and belonging that we know based on science is necessary for students to effectively learn and become masters of the content that we're delivering. It lowers the productivity and limits the problem-solving skills because of the impact that it has on the parts of our brain that perceive threat. And because those parts of our brain that perceive threat are activated in the presence of a microaggression, that increases the cognitive load that is therefore not available to do the learning that we believe is necessary in our schools. It also perpetuates something called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat describes the phenomenon where a minoritized or marginalized individual is carrying within that individual the fear that they might portray, they might display behaviors, or they might confirm stereotypes they believe are held by others. Again, let's think about what that does to the cognitive load on someone who we are expecting to do significant learning in our classrooms and schools. We know that there's a significant damage to mental health, and it creates physical health problems, somatization, where physical health problems begin to develop because of an internal psychological struggle or discontention. And we know that based on Dr. Sue's description, that they're not just individual in their impact, but they're cumulative. In other words, when a person experiences a microaggression, it's an added impact to previous microaggressions and previous exposure to historical harm that has been done to people with that same identity. Now, I recognize that as we think about these impacts, I know that because you all care about students, you care about your family and friends and community members, these are difficult realities to think about. But I want to call on the words of Maya Angelou, who says that all of us are doing the best that we can. And there's no doubt in my mind that everyone here, just by virtue of you being in this space and opening yourself up to the learning that's happening in this space, you are doing the best that you can. And your hope is that you will learn more. And Maya Angelou tells us that as you learn more, as you learn to do better, that's when the change starts to happen. That's when our communities start to heal. So let's think about how we can respond to microaggressions. Many of us can think back on times, Kevin, you mentioned that you remember having been exposed to instances where things were said, things were done that we know were an offense to some of our students or community members. But I can also appreciate that there's often a moment where something should be done, but you can't quite put your finger on what that thing is or who should do it. Well, I would submit that if you witnessed it, you're the person, and I'd like for us to look at some pathways, particularly 4 pathways to responding to microaggressions. So first is a strategy called making the invisible visible. So what this does is it challenges some of the assumptions and implications in the statements that were made. Rather than allowing them to exist in the subtext or to live in the shadows of innuendo, you shine light on the invisible statement and give some air and daylight so that implication, that assumption, the stereotype that was employed in the statement that was made can be challenged. The next is called disarming the microaggression. This is using some kind of verbal or nonverbal communication to express your genuine disagreement and distaste for the thing that was said. This requires a set of beliefs that are anchored in what we know to be true and right and good. And as a society, we've agreed upon those things. And when you disarm the microaggression, what you're really doing is that you're giving some vocal or physical representation to your disagreement. Next is educate the offender. This is my personal favorite. as an educator and as a member of the educational community, I believe it's incumbent upon us to invest in opportunities to help people to learn. But I want to make it clear that as this opportunity to educate presents itself, it's not necessarily the case that we're going to flood them with facts and figures to convince them that their actions were not appropriate. What we're really going to do is help them differentiate between their intentions and their impact, and leaning on the values that we believe they hold to promote some empathy in their behavior and speech. Finally, the fourth path is to seek external intervention. So that means letting someone in authority know that something has happened that should not have happened, that harm has been caused, and in a response from the authorities is necessary. Whether that's the employers, whether that's the administrators, or maybe an advocacy group that we know has a track record of responding to incidences of hate and discrimination. So here's some examples of what these four strategies look and sound like. So an opportunity to make the invisible visible calls out specifically what someone has said. Are you assuming that I'm dangerous because of how I look? I'd like you to make it clear that you're working under assumption that there's some inherent danger because of who I am. Disarming the microaggression might sound like, I don't think what you said is okay. And I would really appreciate it if you spoke differently. I would really appreciate it if you used appropriate language. And my favorite, educating the offender, that sounds like leaning into the values that you believe they hold. We're friends, and I know that you are a caring individual who respects the folks around you, and you hold it true that all individuals can learn. So I want to be clear on the statement that you just made, so that I know that it's in line with what I believe you value as an educator. And finally, seeking external validation just looks like filing a report. I'd like to let you know that there's some behavior happening that I don't believe is helpful for our community. And I think this should be handled by someone other than myself. So I would like to give you all an opportunity to practice these skills. So I'm going to let you all in on a popular, unfortunate statement that was made by a recognizable figure. And I want to let you know ahead of time that, one, this is a political figure, and this conversation is not about politics. It's not about our agreement or disagreement with the individual or their political stance or their platform. It's about the statement that was made. And then two, those statements do have an intersection with the perceptions of people of color, particularly Black men. There will be no slurs used in this statement, but I just want those who are listening to be aware. I'm going to reshare so that you can see the video.
Yes. Who is articulate and bright and clean, nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man. The first sort of mainstream African American. Yes. Who is articulate and bright and clean and nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man.
So rather than play it again, I'll just allow you to read the words on the screen. So I mean, you've got the first sort of mainstream African American who's articulate and bright and clean and nice, a nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook. So for the sake of removing those things from the screen, because I don't enjoy looking at them, we'll go back to our presentation. And I'll let you look at the 4 pathways of responding to microaggressions. And I'll invite you in the chat to type some words that you believe based on those 4 pathways. Well, actually, yeah, all 4. I'm going to invite you to share how you might respond.
Cornelius, would you like them to note which pathway they're talking about? Pathway 1, 2, 3, or 4?
Yeah, you can let us know. Thank you. And I'll put those back on the screen for us. How might you respond if someone made the statements that we just heard? Well, someone did make the statements we just heard. How might you respond? While you're thinking, I was with a group of educators who, when they were considering this work of responding to microaggressions, shared that, this might be somewhat of an unlikely set of statements to encounter. It might not be absolutely likely that someone would make statements such as the ones we just heard. And unfortunately, I had to share with that group of educators that I have had on multiple occasions similar words spoken to me. I have on multiple occasions had similar words spoken to me. So using the strategy, making the invisible visible, one might respond, am I to assume that based on your statement, you do not expect African-American men to be articulate, clean, and acceptable in their behavior? I could ask that question, posed to someone who I believe has the best of intentions, but needs to have the invisible assumptions in their statement made visible. Is it your assumption that Black men don't speak well? Is it your assumption that Black men are not intelligent and do not have the capability to behave in ways that cause them to have mainstream appeal? I could disarm it by saying, I disagree. I don't think Barack Obama is the first, nor will he be the last individual of his complexion to be able to articulate themselves well. And one thing that I appreciate about this example is that it does invite the idea that relationships can continue and flourish despite some statements that were harmful being made. This statement by our current president, Joe Biden, was made near the beginning of his relationship with former President Barack Obama. And I think it's a testament to both of their learning within the context of a working relationship that they continue to work well together. All right, as we consider opportunities to respond and how we might respond, I do want us to consider the idea of calling folks in versus calling folks out. Now, what does it mean to call someone in, and what does it mean to call someone out? Well, this work comes from us from the Harvard Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Department. And it describes calling in as an invitation to some small group thinking. It allows someone to participate in some conversation that helps learning and highlight the prejudice and discriminatory statements or behaviors, versus calling out, which is bringing some public attention to an individual so that others and organizational leaders might take note of that harmful behavior. I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that those are two very distinct pathways toward responding. And they are rightly differentiated by the situation. I'm reading in the chat that people were saying that Biden's words were an attempted compliment, and I would agree. Well, compliment may not be the word I would choose. I believe he was attempting to highlight positive attributes of the Obama candidacy. I think it was looking to bring attention to the qualities that he believed would make Barack Obama successful as a candidate. What he may not have realized in the moment is that his words were playing on a popularly held stereotypical belief that those things are not typically true of Black men. And I would imagine that over the course of his relationship, there were conversations between himself and President Obama that helped him understand that the positive attributes of President Obama's candidacy went far beyond him not comporting to the stereotypes that may or may not be held by some voters who did not know or have contact with Black men who were articulate. It was about much more than that. But I think you're right in that in the chat, we've also identified that the best path forward in that scenario was education. And I would tend to agree. So let's think about what it means to call someone in and call someone out and what makes those scenarios different. So the folks at Harvard name in the need to call in the idea of the influence that you may have with that individual. So relationship definitely plays a strong part in your decision to either call in or call out. And within the context of a relationship, you may be the one, if only one of a few voices, to help someone come to a better understanding of the harm that they have just caused. There also has to be taken into consideration the relative safety of you as the person who heard and is now responding to the microaggression. And it also is important to consider the openness that that person might be demonstrating to learning something new. Versus calling out, well, how urgent is the situation? Is the harm being done immediate? And is someone in need of urgent or immediate attention? If so, that may require a calling out versus a calling in. And it also necessary to think about the opportunity to influence the safety of others. And finally, how open might the person be? And if you already have some indication that that individual might not be open to learning something new, then that may be necessary to call someone out rather than call them in. But I'd like for us, because we are educators and working from the educational mindset, like to consider call-in conversations specifically. So Liz Kleinrock, in her book, Start Here, Start Now, says this about calling conversations. She says, when someone makes a harmful remark in front of us, our instincts typically tell us to respond combatively and avoid the subject or change the subject or lose our train of thought. And she categorizes those in fight, flight, or freeze responses. She says that we can prepare responses to meet our own needs and create teachable moments. The idea here is taking some opportunity to do some reflection about your natural tendency, what you are most likely to do, how you're most likely to respond in situations where there's some tension and there's some pressure to say something, identifying your natural tendency might help you determine what is the most natural or most comfortable way for you to respond. So think to yourself, are you a fight individual? Are you likely to have the urge to respond aggressively? Are you a flight person? Are you a person who would likely attempt to avoid the situation or escape the scenario where the inappropriate words were shared? Or are you a freeze individual? Does your thinking cause you to go silent and therefore miss an opportunity to respond to a thing that requires a response? Take a moment to think about which one that you are. What's your natural tendency? What are you most likely to do in a tense situation where someone has shared some inappropriate words, has made a statement that is harmful to you or to others? And once you've decided which one you are, I know which one I am, consider these responses. So if your natural tendency is to fight, you can respond by saying, your comment doesn't reflect the values of this classroom community. Can you explain why you made the choice that you made? If your natural tendency is to flight or to avoid a situation, you might explain what's happening internally for you. I'm having a reaction to what you just said, and I need a few moments to collect my thoughts before we speak. If your natural tendency is to freeze, you can pose a question so that you might give yourself an opportunity to expose the thinking rather than address it with your own words. What did you mean by that comment? Liz Kleinrock goes on to say that at the end of the day, students need spaces where they can be vulnerable and brave in order to learn. Teachers are also learners, and they need to draw on their vulnerability and encourage in order to best support their students. Throughout my years in the classroom, I have heard kids of all backgrounds make comments about people's races, cultures, accents, foods, religious clothing, abilities, you name it. Many of their remarks stem from ignorance, and I expect this from them because they're children. And this is my favorite sentence in this quote. Shaming kids for their ignorance is unproductive. All it does is teach them to fear being wrong or asking questions. Shame encourages them to disengage. And I would say that that's not just true for kids and students. I believe that's true for adults too. Now, I fervently believe that there are some moments where it is very necessary to call someone out for a microaggression. But I also realize that as an educator, it's incumbent upon me to take an opportunity to help someone learn, be they a student, a child, or an adult, a colleague. And if my response generates a shame, a sense of guilt, and a sense of disengagement, then I lose my opportunity to help that person think and understand better how their words might have impacted others. So I noticed that someone mentioned that there were some questions, and I do want to take some opportunity, if we have time, to address some of those questions.
We absolutely do, Cornelius. Hang on just a minute. Let me pull those up.
While you're doing that, I do want to share that there's an upcoming opportunity at Oakland Schools on November 16th to participate in a half-day, either AM or PM, session on inclusive classroom practices and strategies. This will be facilitated by myself. And if you are an Oakland Schools teacher, an educator, instructional coach, if you are working with the equity team, if you'd like to bring some of these strategies back to your school, I would invite you to navigate to the Oakland Schools website and either search by my name or the name of the course. And I can also put the link for this course in the chat for all of our Oakland Schools attendees.
I think that would be good to put it in the chat for everybody, Cornelius, even though they have this they'll have it there as well. So there are 2 half-day sessions and people can sign up for either or.
Yeah, and if you happen to not be in Oakland County, I'd still invite you to reach out. I would love to connect with you and discuss some ways that we might be able to bring this to your school community. So I will put a copy of a link where you can schedule some time to connect with me. This gives you some access to my calendar, and then you can schedule a virtual meeting where we can.
Oh, that's great. Somebody just asked, will this be available to educators outside Oakland schools?
Absolutely. And then finally, I also wanted to share the full PDF document of that work from the Harvard School of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging.
Right.
So there is that.
Awesome. Thank you. There is so much in, you know, the area of microaggression, and as you were kind of going through some of these things, I was thinking back of, you know, my years of working and interacting with people and kind of witnessing and seeing some of that, and sometimes trying to be helpful. But as you said, sometimes it's easier to do the call in and the call out, you know, to kind of make things still smooth or try to make that change. So very important to kind of have that input from you for all of us. So we do have a couple questions, you know. So how do you share this with educators without them feeling like they're being attacked? This is from Melissa.
Yeah, and Melissa, that's a great question. And I really appreciate your concern about retaining and holding close a relationship with a colleague, but still helping to have some positive influence over their practice, as well as attempting to prevent further harm to students or other folks who might be exposed to that behavior. I think you're right on track in that, you know, the desire is to maintain the relationship. So in that third strategy where you seek to educate, I love beginning with leaning into the values that you believe that individual holds. So say your coworker, Jeff, made a statement that you find to be harmful to some members of your school community. You can say, Jeff, we've known each other for years, and you know, I've really come to appreciate how well you lean into developing close relationship with students and parents. So I was really confused, and I wanted to ask you about a statement that you made, because I know that you care so much about the folks that we serve every day. What might have been your intention when making X statement? And then are you aware that Y impact resulted from X statement?
Yeah. Brad wants to know, it's kind of really on that too, is what about real versus perceived harm in what's coming through in a microaggression? I mean, you gave that long list, but is there, you know, what is the real harm, which there is? To some, they may be just a perceived harm in what they say or do.
Well, I think that's a good question, and you know, I would follow a question was, you know, how do we determine the difference between real and perceived harm?
Right.
Because perception is the world that our minds occupy. So if the harm is in the world of my perception, you know, is that real harm? I would posit that it is. But I think the question for us when we're, you know, maybe wading through the waters of what might be impactful, what might be less impactful, is to what degree are we invested in the social and emotional well-being of the individuals that we're serving? And how might we ensure that that social and emotional well-being is secure such that academic gains are more possible? I think as educators, we're very right to center learning. And what I often encounter are conversations that pit learning against well-being, as if
Right.
they are mutually exclusive. But there's so much research, there's so much scholarship that informs our practice and lets us know that social and emotional well-being, that that the feeling of safety, well-being, and belonging students experience is directly impacted and has a direct influence on their ability to learn in our educational spaces. So whether we have a focus on well-being, because that happens to be a priority for us as an educator, or we might strictly be focused on content and learning, I think it's still, part of our responsibility to safeguard those spaces such that learning is possible.
Absolutely. Emma in Canton wants to know, excuse me, how can students have these conversations with teachers and administrators? And then also part two is how can parents, when they're already being thought of as a threat, have these conversations? So two-part of there. So how can the students have these conversations with teachers and admins, and also the same like with parents and teachers?
Yeah, and I think, that's a great question. And what I hope that we continue to do as an educational community is lean into the agency that we have, and that we control nearly 100% of our classroom and school environments. So as teachers, we close the door in those classrooms, and we are the masters of our domain. Like, clearly there are some expectations from the district and expectations from our main office, but for the most part, we have an opportunity to set the stage for all kinds of learning and great inquiry and conversations. So I think it starts with setting an environment that allows for inquiry and allows for mistakes. This takes so much grace, and it takes so much understanding that as humans, it is unavoidable that you will say and do things that cause some harm to others. But when you've prioritized connection and you've prioritized relationships, that puts the harm that might be caused to others over any invisible intentions that I might have held when making one statement or another. So being able to set the stage for a sense of community in our classrooms and our school buildings, where people do feel free to ask questions, to engage in some courageous conversations. But again, that takes some practice and some skill as well. So I think it's really important that as educators who do have some control in those classroom and school buildings, that we begin sharpening our skills. I believe it's like a lot of other things, in that the muscle to have difficult conversations about issues that are emotionally charged can atrophy when we don't use it. And then for how long, generations, I would submit, that we've spent not having some of these really important conversations.
Yeah, I think with everything else we've kind of talked about, we talked about coming out of the pandemic earlier. We've talked about it with ADL and how those words are impacting people, and like bullying prevention. It's an ongoing process, as you just said, that this is something where you can start it at a certain age group, and you probably have to revise it as they get older. They're going to come into who they are as different people. Mm-hmm. And probably have to readdress this. I would think it'd be a great conversation in a classroom to educate them how they're inadvertently or unknowingly, in ways harming each other. So I think it would be a really good exercise. But if there was going to be an exercise, how controlled can a teacher make it? I mean, can they go through those four things? One, they come to your workshop first.
Well, I
talk
think
with you.
Absolutely. I think it starts with kind of setting a set of norms for our classroom.
Right.
And this doesn't have to go all the way into the weeds necessarily. It could be a norm that says we value the feelings of others. So we'll prioritize, acknowledging and establishing understanding when someone shares that something we said or did caused some emotional or physical harm. Right. Even when our intentions are good, because we care, that's the kind of community that we have. Because we care, we're going to invest in making that right. It doesn't mean that someone's a bad person because they've said or done something. I've got 3 kids at home. I've got a 4-year-old, a 9-year-old, and an 11-year-old. So I'll talk to my 4-year-old and I'll say, well, something you did hurt your sister. And she'll say, well, I didn't mean to. And I understand. And I think that you're a really good little girl who doesn't hurt others on purpose, but that doesn't make your sister feel any better. So what should we do about it? What's our next step?
We're all here because we care, we care
Absolutely.
about those people, and we are all educators in some way, and we give our all to other people. So Cornelius, pleasure meeting you. Thank you for giving us your time, giving us your expertise. Thank you for all the information in the chat, and for all of you nearby to Oakland, or do a little traveling, go see Cornelius. He'll work it all out for you. So Cornelius, thank you so very, very much for joining us today.
And thank you so much for this time, and for also making this space available for folks to learn more. Really appreciate it, what I was able to take away as well.
Yeah, it's great. That's what we want this to do. Thank you, sir.